We hope that you enjoyed the show. There are so many more for you here on selfdiscoverywisdom.com. Just go to the podcast tab at the top there and you will see all the many genres and all 3,000 shows ready for your listening. We are here to serve you, to help you on your journey of life, and we know that through inspiration, it begets invitation. We are supported by you, the listeners, and those that we interview. Anything that you can spare us in donation would be greatly accepted, and we do hope that you enjoy the next show. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of An Author's Kiss right here on selfdiscoverywisdom.com. I'm your host, Sarah Troy, and my guest that is joining me today, all the way from New York, is Patrick Horrigan, and he's written a book about the American scholar. And he represents the LGBTQ genre, so it's the Next Generation Indie Book Award for LGBTQ plus fiction. He says that on creating a complex characters, LGBT characters, amidst the backdrop of the AIDS-ravaged 80s and the Trump-challenged 2010s, Kirkus Reviews calls his latest historical fiction novel, American Scholar, a haunting, complex look at love, gay history, and the passing of time. This book is the winner of the Next Generation Indie Book Award. And Patrick will talk about how he created the emotional story that brews a mist amongst the backdrop of the political polarizing of today's America, and reflections on the tumultuous days of AIDS in the 1980s. For many people listening, they may be too young to remember what the 80s was all about and AIDS and how ravaging it was. And it's good for you to listen to this show to actually understand exactly what everybody went through. He is an award-winning novelist. He's a professor, essayist, and a playwright. He's the author of the Pennsylvania Station. He's written a novel, Portraits of an Exhibition, and he's the winner of the Dana Award for the fiction, as well as Mary Glenn Cox. His other works, he's included his memoir, Widescreen Dreams, Growing Up, Gay at the Movies, and Play Messages of Glory, a drama in a voicemail. And he's done so much here. Let's just get on with the show and actually unpack everything right here, right now. I don't want to be reading it all. I want to discover you, what you're doing here. This is a bold journey to kind of cover the AIDS, in the 80s and the early 90s, very much so as well, and just how horrific it really was. But you refer to 2010s and this whole gay bashing that is going on right now, which is ignorance and fear, and just stupidity all around, quite honestly. We're not designed wrong. Everybody that has their differences, their idiosyncrasies, they were designed right, and we're all meant to be ourselves, and there's a reason for us being who we are. So whether we're gay, whether we're straight, whether we're white, black, pink, yellow, polka dot, woman, man, or whatever, it's really about the kind of the heart and the soul and the character of who we are, not the package we come in. But as a gay person, most certainly you're representing that voice, but you must have had many of your challenges yourself. Welcome to the show, love.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's lovely to be here.
So let's talk about the AIDS in the 80s. As I said, if anybody remembers it and lived through it, whether you were gay or not, it was just, when you look at the coronavirus and how ravaging it was, well, that's kind of how AIDS was amongst the LGBTQ community at that time. And just so much backlash and so much misinformation and so much persecution that others went through. So from your side of it, how do you see it?
Well, I turned 20 in 1983, and I often think about what age or what year someone turned 20, because that's, in a way, that's the year when you start to really, that's the age when you start to come into yourself and you start becoming an adult. I was in college, and HIV and AIDS were only discovered in the summer of 1981. So by the time I turned 20 and was starting to become sexually active in college, it was still very much there was a lot about the disease that was unknown.
Yeah.
I remember having a boyfriend my senior year of college, and we were both very new to the experience of dating. But I remember we both sort of looked at each other and said, "Are we going to get AIDS by
Yeah.
being boyfriends?"
Yes.
And there were just so many basic questions that we didn't have answers to. And one of the things that I try to address in my new novel, American Scholar, is the experience of being a young person in your 20s coming into your sexuality precisely at the moment where there's this
Mm.
deadly sexually transmitted disease, and just what that's like trying to cope with that as you're also embarking on this important phase of your development.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so much misinformation. It's rather like the virus, that there was not enough known, but a great deal speculated on. Right.
Yes.
And so the amount that came out of there, of especially painting the gay community, sleaze bags, this, that, etc. Right.
Yeah.
It's because they have so many sexual partners and because of this and because of that. And of course, yeah, I always, way media goes at things on the attack and the information and the clarity of it is way back here.
Hmm.
It's not reporting, it's speculation. But it stirs up so much fear. And
Yeah.
you're not knowing just in a normal relationship with your boyfriend that does that mean it's an automatic death sentence onto you?
Exactly.
Because literally it was killing people before they really understood what was killing them.
That's right. That's right. So it was a challenging time to be in one's 20s.
Mm,
And I graduated from college in 1985, and then I moved to New York City. And within a couple of years, I got involved in AIDS activism. I
hmm.
joined the AIDS activist group ACT UP, and that was a really important experience for me because finally I was in a community of people where we were really educating ourselves about the disease, about the virus, and about the politics of that, and pushing back
Yeah,
against discrimination and misinformation. Um, and so, although it was still a scary time, friends and boyfriends were getting sick, some were dying. There was uh, a feeling that we were doing something, and we were being effective.
yeah,
Uh, Life-saving treatment was finally developed in 1995. So
right.
it was really the first 15 years of the
Mm,
epidemic where there was no treatment. There's
hmm.
still no cure, but now there's treatment.
Yes.
Now, if a person becomes HIV positive, it's a chronic condition. It's
Hmm.
not a death sentence. But
Yes.
it was more or less a death sentence for the first 15 years of the epidemic. Um,
And I mean, everybody was how do you have a good relationship with someone? Because it took a long time before they could even do a test to whether you had it or not, because
exactly,
it was a question mark of what was it?
exactly, exactly. Yes, I remember all the stages of development. I
Mm,
remember when the virus was first identified,
mm,
when the disease went from being called GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, to HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, or AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. I remember when the names for things were getting pinned down. I
yeah.
remember when the test for HIV became available. For many years, the only drug that was available was something called AZT, and it was a drug that made people very sick, and it
Mm,
was very expensive.
mm,
So not only was it not very effective, but it was also hard to obtain. Um, I remember, especially when I was involved in AIDS activism, we would hear about all kinds of alternative treatments coming from all places around the world. You would hear about some root in Japan that people were taking, and
hmm.
it seemed to be helpful. We people were seizing on anything and everything
Everything.
to,
Hmm.
you know,
The
find some
last grasp, right?
really, yeah,
The hope,
yeah,
constant hope. Yeah.
yeah. Um, I was in graduate school by the time I joined the AIDS activist movement, and ACT UP had its meetings once a week at the lesbian and gay community center in New York City every Monday night. And I would go almost every Monday, and it was like taking another graduate class. It was such an incredible
Mm.
education in so many things. And
And that were not mainstream.
that were not mainstream,
Hmm.
although it fed my work in graduate school in all kinds of
Mm.
unexpected ways. And it really transformed me as a person and as an intellectual, eventually as a writer. So part of what my new novel is addressing is this whole experience of that time in
Yeah.
the 80s, early 90s.
I mean, although it was classified as the gay disease, um, and again, the ostracization and everything else that went on with that, it became almost that you can't touch anyone that was gay, or that it was transmitted by a kiss, or if you shook their hand, and then the fear just trickled on, and then blood transfusions and all of
Yeah,
this type of thing. And it's like, it's just the same here with our latest one with COVID, is that fear
yeah.
sells. Fear sells. And, if we stop buying the fear and start having the conversation of what do we know, and everybody sharing a little bit of what they know, we kind of get to the results of the truth a lot faster than we do from the fearing. But there's so much fearing that went on at that time across the board that to be a gay person at that time, I imagine would have been extremely hard because, in every relationship, you look, I really like this person, but, right? And the fear is there.
I remember thinking at the time that being a young gay person in the 80s was like walking around with a rain cloud over my head.
Mm,
And nobody else had this rain cloud over their head, but it was
yeah.
over my head.
Uh-huh.
Because I remember, I would have conversations with my parents, and occasionally they would ask me, questions about my work as an AIDS activist, and they were very wary of that. They were concerned about that. They were very afraid of me getting arrested.
Yes.
Um, and of course they were concerned about my health.
Hmm.
Um, but it was like having a conversation with people who, not really through any fault of their own, but we're just outside of this experience. And
Yes.
we know that HIV and AIDS touch everybody, that
Yeah.
nobody is immune from it,
Right.
but it because of the accidents of history, it happened to infiltrate the gay community first, and that's
Hmm.
where it spread the fastest, and that's where the news about HIV and AIDS was bubbling up from. It was bubbling
Right.
up from that community, but it wasn't only that community that was affected,
Yes.
but sometimes it felt as if you were just alone in this
Mm.
experience, and other people, you know, couldn't quite understand. I remember my mother telling me one time she'd read an article about cancer research and how, so much money this was later, this was probably in the early 90s, so much money was being poured into AIDS research. What about other diseases? And I remember it made me so angry.
Mm.
And I was so young and I didn't really know how to
Filter.
manage my anger and filter those comments and respond in a way that
Yeah.
was helpful. Um, and that was another thing, ACT UP stands for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And the
Mm.
slogan of ACT UP was a group of people united in anger to stop
Mm.
the AIDS crisis. And I remember anger was it was very much at the surface in those
The
days
state of
from
being.
a lot of
Mm.
people that I was involved with.
Yeah. I mean,
And
could you imagine if it was now, though, with social media? I mean, we've seen, like,
mm,
you Trump in 2010 and DeSantis now and all of that, and you look at the social media and Harry carries misinformation. But basically today, whatever we see, some people believe it blindly and others don't believe anything anymore because there's so much fake news out there. But could you imagine during the AIDS time, if we had had social media and of just how much worse it would have been because the pitchforks and the guns would have been out there?
it might have been. At the same time, I think about something like the monkeypox virus, which
Mm,
which happened last summer.
yes.
And I was struck by how quickly the gay community galvanized itself and rallied around rallied together to really tackle that virus. And within a couple of months, it was really not a problem.
Right.
And I think, a lot of that had to do with social media. It also had to do with, 30 years of developments around lesbian and gay
Mm.
rights issues. Um,
It's a different
so
time.
but it's a good question that you ask. What would it have been like in the 80s if we'd had social media, for better and for worse? That's a
Yeah.
good question. It's a good thought experiment.
Well, I mean, you referred to Trump and the tens, and we've got the DeSantis, and we've got all this anti-gay stuff that's going on out there right now. And it's like, it's trying to put the genie back in the bottle. The acceptance is out there by many. It's
Mm-hmm.
the few
Yeah.
that scream the loudest, and trying to
Yeah.
turn the clock back to the
Sure.
dark ages. And it's like, it's the same with women's liberation. We're out of the womb. You can't put us back. And it's
Yeah.
but I always find it's the people that are scared the most because they're so insecure in themselves that protest the most.
Yeah.
Right? And, people who know they're different or people who know they have a struggle, they look for their like vibe where,
Mm.
you can come together. But for the people that have been brought up fearfully, God will, or you're different. And very often we find closeted people are the ones that protest so much because they don't want to come out.
Mhm.
How do you find that protesting and the general status of things at the present moment?
I was talking with a friend just yesterday about this. I I grew up, uh, as a child, and then as into my adulthood, with the idea that although a particular time might be a dark time,
Hmm.
or a particular incident might be, um, bad in some ways, that things were in general getting better,
Yeah,
that progress was being made. And I'm going to be 60 years old next year.
still a
So
little one.
in my in my lifetime, you know, I've seen a lot of progress around human rights issues.
Mm.
Um, but for the first time in my life, I feel like we're seeing the clock being turned backward in some way,
Yes.
and I'm shocked that that's
Yeah.
happened. My parents were teenagers in World War II,
Hmm.
so they grew up in the Depression, then through the Second World War. They got married, they raised their children in the 1960s and 70s. They witnessed a lot, they saw a lot, um, as have we. But I don't know. But you said something important a minute ago. You said that it's the vocal few who
Mm.
seem to be
The
controlling
loudest. Yeah.
this
Mm.
backlash right now, and
Mm.
and for whatever reason, those vocal few seem to have an enormous amount of power right now, or
Why? Why are
a,
we giving
a
them that
role.
power?
I don't know. I don't know.
Why do we climb on this bandwagon? Why are these people climbing on this bandwagon? Is it a certain human nature that just wants to bring out the pitchforks and the guns and just get at people because they're different? Is it something that's within themselves that is lacking, that they fear anybody else that has embraced themselves?
Yeah.
Because if you ask them, I mean, I used to watch The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, and he had one guy that used to go out to the Trump rallies, and he would ask them very rational, logical questions, and the answers back were always Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
They couldn't give an answer back. They couldn't give a why. All they could do is follow the rant and the rage, and
Mhm.
it kind of makes you ask about humanity: are we comfortable in the rant and rage where we have to abstain of taking any responsibility? We can always blame everyone else. Is that part of the reason for the rant and the rage? Or are those people just so completely lost and delusional that they don't know that there is another world out there that they can embrace?
Mm. Yeah, these are really hard questions to answer, um, in my novel, the protagonist who was uh, a young man in his 20s during the 1980s, by the 2010s is now a middle-aged man in his 50s.
Hmm.
And there's a passage in the novel where he's thinking about all the events in recent history that this particular beloved person of his has missed because that person died in 1990. And he goes through this gamut of things that includes the rise of the internet and
Hmm.
email and cell phones
Hmm.
and the election of Barack Obama and Black Lives Matter and the candidacy of Hillary Clinton, which, you know, the novel, one strand of the novel takes place a week before the 2016 election.
Hmm.
And the protagonist is convinced that Hillary Clinton is going to win, absolutely convinced. Um, the reason I'm mentioning this is because that character, who is very much based on myself, frequently gets it wrong,
Hmm.
frequently misjudges the situation. He misjudges people he disagrees with.
Hmm.
On some level, he does not understand.
Right.
There's a passage which, whenever I read it, it gets a kind of rueful laugh from people, and it goes something like, even when Hillary Clinton becomes president, Donald Trump and his followers are not going to go away quietly, at
Mhm.
least for a year or two. Exactly.
I
Exactly.
know. And it's like the question begs is that how could we get it so wrong? I think that 2016, when he was elected, was sent shockwaves through anybody with rational thinking. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, how? What did we miss? You know, was it just the mob? I've interviewed people that voted for Trump purely on the basis to protect their money.
Yeah.
And if you ask them about the moral of the man, what he stands for, who he is as a person representing a whole country.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I don't pay attention to that. As long
Right.
as my money is okay. And I think
Right.
that's what we underestimated. We underestimated the person who would protect their purse.
And yes, there's that. And then there was an irrational hatred of Hillary Clinton. I remember having a conversation with a relative who was planning on voting for Trump. And they said the reason they were going to vote for Trump was A, because Trump loves his children, and two, because Hillary Clinton is a bag. And that was the argument. And
Irrational. I mean, this is the thing.
yeah, yeah, just
There's no
stupefying.
conversation. There's just statement, right?
Yeah,
This is the whole thing about just before the election with the emails.
yeah,
And you look at what Trump has done in the meantime and still is
yeah,
doing,
yeah,
and it's like in not so long ago, any president who misrepresented themselves or was corrupt or did anything, they were out of office like that.
yeah,
America had higher standards,
yeah,
and then he's brought those standards right down to the gutter,
yeah.
and everybody's just watching, shaking their heads. But if you don't get with it, either him or DeSantis is going to be back up again. And I don't get it.
I know. I don't pretend to have the answers
I
either.
know. I know it's a frustration, isn't it? Because, we think that LGBTQ community, and transgender, which I've had the honor of interviewing, and people that are binary, it is all about that acceptance. It's been a hard journey for them to accept themselves. I'm sure when you first came out to your parents, there must have been an awful lot of nerves and fear there. And how many kids are kicked out of the family
Hmm.
because they revealed who they were? That's a hard enough journey to come out and own who you are. And never mind, it's a confusing journey for you to navigate that in the first place. Never mind coming out to anyone, and that bravery that's already there. And then society, some part of society celebrating you, another part of society as is wanting to pitchfork you. And it's like, when are we going to get over ourselves and realize it's not the package we come in, it's the heart and soul of who we are.
So for 30 years, I was a university professor. I taught literature. I recently took early retirement so that I could focus full time on writing. But I had a colleague at my university, this wonderful woman named Deborah, and Deborah was a red diaper baby. She grew up with parents who were on the left, and she was really schooled in a progressive outlook on life. And she's my generation.
Mm,
Um, but I remember something that Deborah would always say whenever we would talk about, problems at the university, struggles we would have with the administration, or if we were just talking about politics. Deborah had this idea that life is about struggle. It's
mm,
about engaging in the struggle, and the struggle doesn't end. It doesn't stop. And for her, I think what keeps her going and what keeps her committed is a hope for progress, but also just some level of enjoyment in
mm.
engaging in the struggle. And
Yeah,
I'm fascinated by that.
a bit of
Um,
addiction.
maybe. I mean, I was an AIDS activist for several years as a young person, and then I started teaching full time, and I really shifted my focus from protesting and street action to the action
Educational.
of the classroom and
Yes.
education.
Yeah.
And now I'm not teaching anymore. Now I'm writing full time. I'm also training to become a tour guide at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but which is another form of education.
Mhm.
So I feel like I've put my energies in education. When Trump was elected, my husband and I joined an anti-Trump organization called Rise and Resist.
Mm.
And for a couple of months, we were involved in various kinds of actions around all the issues that were coming up when he first got elected. But I found it really exhausting to keep up that
Yes.
energy.
Yes.
I'm not a kid anymore. And
Even
uh,
if you were, though, it's draining to
it
be
is.
constantly, it's
It is.
draining. And
It is.
and what people don't realize is that it starts breaking down not only your mental psyche, but your physical.
Does.
Right? You can't carry that kind of anger around you all the time without paying a price.
That's absolutely right. And I also think that to have an adversarial relationship to the world, it's draining, as you say. It's also, on some level, I feel like it's not accurate. It's not an accurate way of living in the world. It's not a correct way of living in the
No.
world because people are complicated. The
Yes.
very relative that I just quoted a few minutes ago about his reason for voting for Donald Trump, I also happen to love this person.
Yes.
He's a very lovable person. So it's things are just always more complicated.
Right. There's no black and white of which certain people like to make it. You're either with me or against me.
Yeah.
And that's very Trumpism, as we refer to.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Trumpism
Yeah.
is an analogy that we use a lot. Um, and the thing is about life is that when you accept yourself, no matter what package you come in or whatever you're dealing with, when you actually embrace your own light, your own gift, your own reason for being, and you know what your contribution is to the world, you want to feed that light a lot more because you know it's more productive. It's more creative. It's more compassionate and encompassing. And for people that choose to live in that anger all the time, no, I can get pissed off with things that are going on because I just don't understand the rationale behind it.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, spend your anger, rant and rave for a moment or two, but don't become emotional about your emotion
Yeah.
because then it can be all consuming. And for some people that live in that struggle and that strife all the time, it does become a form of addiction
Mm.
because it also becomes a form of escapism. I'm struggling. Feel sorry for me. I'm never going to get there. And every single one of us has to be responsible for our own choices and actions. We can't choose what happens to us, but we can choose how we react on it. And we
Mhm.
can choose who we want to be and embrace who we really are and step into that light. It doesn't mean we're not going to get mad, but we choose to feed the love rather than the hate.
Mhm. I remember there was some discussion in the 1980s during the worst years of the AIDS epidemic about the experience of being an activist and um, how challenging it was on an emotional level. And part of the problem was that, we were trying to make all this change happen while at the same time dealing with all this personal loss,
Yeah.
and somehow managing the kind of public discourse around
Hmm.
HIV and AIDS and the personal loss and the trauma of that loss. That was really hard to do.
Yes.
Um, and some people were able to do it, but a lot of people weren't. And people are different from each other, and
Yes.
you sort of find the place where you can be most effective.
I mean, AIDS was very, very cruel, and when it grabbed hold of someone and it took them down the spiral, very painful and debilitated very quickly. Whereas you look at someone with cancer, it's a slower process, a
Mm-hmm.
slower decline, which actually gives you more time to come back to it. But with
Mm-hmm.
AIDS, it seemed to be that, once you got it, it became full-fledged. And
Yeah,
and and then of course how many people died alone because people were afraid to be around them. Oh, you
yeah,
can breathe it in with the air, or you could do this and that. And it's like these people are dying alone. And that is just heartbreaking.
yeah. I taught a course on AIDS literature at my university about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was a wonderful class. The students were all in their early 20s. Most of them had never heard about the AIDS epidemic. They didn't know
I
about it.
know, I know.
Um, they learned very little about it in school themselves, in their health education classes. But once we got into the literature and the history, they were fascinated, and um, yeah, I mean, it was really eye opening, and they couldn't believe that they didn't learn this history. They were shocked
And
that
it's not that long ago.
it's not that long
Yeah,
ago.
I
I
know.
know, I
It's
know,
yeah, we lived through it, but for them, they've just been born on how many millennial
exactly,
kids do we have now?
exactly.
Um, but it's the same that we see with Nazism. These
Yes,
people, because it's not talked about, because the horrors and the atrocities that were happening during that time are not talked about, it's
yeah,
glamified.
yeah,
And you've got these, well, what do they call them? The Proud Boys or whatever, which I
yeah,
always find, pride and proud, it's the name that they call themselves and they're anti, you know. But
right,
you've got so many of them out there embracing this because they feel romanticized almost by it. But do you
yeah,
actually know the horrors and the atrocities and that it,
yeah,
it was marked, one of the worst time periods in the history of man,
yeah.
and the choices that were made. And it's the same with pulling down statues and things like this.
Mm,
No, re-educate, leave the statue there, but re-educate.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Re-educate. What are you trying to do? Obliterate history? You can't do that. But what you can do is look at history differently.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting connection you make between all the controversy around statues and memorials and
Hmm.
the way we're rewriting history. Yeah,
And we shouldn't be rewriting history. History is there. You cannot undo what has been done, but we can learn from it. And the thing about anything that was that horrific is to learn how can we be more aware and what can we do differently in other situations. And if we erase that history, what basis are we giving them in order to reflect back on, okay, that was done, that shouldn't have been done that way, because of that, we're going to do it differently. And if you take
yeah,
that history away, then you're actually taking away, creativity that could come out of it.
yeah, yeah. So I mentioned that I'm training to become
Hmm.
a tour guide. One of the initiatives that the Metropolitan Museum of Art has been doing in recent years is they're trying to recontextualize certain works of art that are now seen as problematic. So, for
Mm.
example, there's a beautiful statue of a Native American in the American wing. It's a 19th century statue, and he's sitting on a rock, and he's very pensive. And instead of removing the statue because it makes a statement that some people now feel uncomfortable with. Next to the original label for the statue, the Met has invited artists and intellectuals to make a kind of counter statement.
Mm.
So there are two labels there,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you get to read two different points of view about this work of art, and so it starts a dialogue.
Which we need to have. I'm a true colors coach. Myers-Briggs, the four key personality traits. And
Uh-huh.
each one of those traits is going to perceive and interact according to what their personality trait is. And if you
Uh-huh.
don't have all four represented, then you don't have those four conversations, four corners of conversation. And
Yeah.
when it's going to be a one-sided argument. But if you're willing to listen to all four, we're going to learn something that we did not know because it's a different perspective. And I
Yeah.
feel that, we uh, certain parties want to keep channeling us down one dialogue and say that's the only dialogue.
Yeah.
And where we need to actually open and expand that dialogue and listen to everyone in order to see a clearer picture.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a statue in front of the Museum of Natural History here in New York of Teddy Roosevelt on a horse,
Mm-hmm.
and next to him on either side there was an African on one side and a Native American on the other, and they formed this triangle. And to a lot of people, it looked like the white man was at the
Was
apex of the
superior. Yeah.
triangle, and the
Mm-hmm.
people of color were down below. And so the museum has removed the statue. I'm I forget where it's going. It's going to a museum, I believe, or maybe it's being moved inside the museum. But it's not going to be just erased and forgotten. It's going to be part of a dialogue and a conversation, and
If you
that has
wanted to change it up, then what you could have is still uh, both sides with him in a wheelchair because he represented a disability.
oh
But
FDR, yeah,
right,
yeah.
right.
This
So,
is Teddy Roosevelt.
oh, Teddy Roosevelt, right? Yes.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
right, getting my
The earlier
heartstrings mixed up.
Roosevelt.
Right. I think, but this is again, when you're talking about people with disabilities, I call the lovely woman I interviewed called Susan, called them differently abled, which I think is the way we
Yeah.
should look at people if they're differently abled. And just because they're differently able doesn't mean they're wrong or broken or should be dismissed. It just means they look at things or their challenges make them look at things and face things in a different way. And again, let's open up to that perspective because it can be something that could broaden us. But we love to have everybody in a nice, neat little box with a bow, like sheeple. All right.
Mhm.
And if you're not part of that box, then there's something wrong with you. Whereas, as Forrest Gump says, life is a box of chocolates. Who wants the same chocolate over and over again? Right? So I think there's a long way to go that we still to look at it. Apart from what's happening right now, where you really are looking at the persecution starting all over again, and you have been working with young people. How do they look at that? When you talked about AIDS and you talked about the LGBTQ community, what was their perspective on what's going on now?
That's a good question. There's a way in which the young people that I encountered at the university take certain things for granted
Mm,
about diversity and inclusiveness that I didn't experience when I was their age.
hmm
Um, not in every single case. There were some kids who were. I mean, it was a self-selecting group, the students who enrolled in this particular class. But speaking more broadly about all the students that I taught over many years and taught a variety of material to, not just LGBT related. Um, I mean, it does seem like some progress has been made in the sense that, as I said, young people seem to they seem to live out certain notions of justice and equality that, as I said, I didn't experience growing up. Um, but it also depends on the individual. You know, I taught a lot of students who came from very religious
Yeah.
backgrounds, and those students had a harder time often
Hmm.
wrapping their minds around certain ideas.
Yeah. Or
Uh,
or if they were gay or anything in any way, would never dream of coming out for the fear of persecution from their own family. Yeah.
yes, yeah,
So they were the silent strugglers. So while everybody else is talking about inclusivity, they knew that they couldn't be that, because if it got back to their family or their church that was still narrow-minded, that they would be the ones to suffer for it. So there's still the people that have those restraints on them. And,
yeah,
although we hopefully will never see the like of, AIDS pandemic in the way that it was before, we still see people not accepting people for who they are.
yeah,
And, we've got this, I watch RuPaul and the Drag Race. I love it. I love the creativity and everything else that goes on there. I mean, it's incredible talent. And there was one thing of somebody drew a picture of Trump in drag behind bars, which I thought was really hilarious. But um,
mm-hmm.
it's you've got these people that taking books off the shelves,
Mm-hmm.
trying to delete history, or no, you can't read about that. And if what world are you in? You could take them off the shelves, but we've got this thing called the internet. Somebody
Yeah,
will have that book somewhere.
yeah,
You're trying to suppress, but who are you speaking to? You're speaking to the people that are the sheeple, that
yeah,
live in the fear and that you can puppeteer. But they're
mm-hmm.
not the people who won't stand for this, because we're going to stand up and speak out for those people, even if they're unable to do so themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
We got to talk about it, right? We have to talk about it. We have to, the fact that you've written this book what is it, 40 years later on AIDS, 30, 40 years later, that, it's a good reminder for people that, what I mean, the young people don't know it never happened. With all this information that we have at our fingertips these days, and what, you didn't know about it?
mm-hmm.
Nobody's talked about it. Was it
Mm-hmm.
something that was so shameful nobody wanted to talk about? In 20 years, are we going to look at COVID and forget about the years that we've went through with that? It's We need to have our young people aware. They need to actually understand what the generations before them has gone through,
Mm-hmm.
to understand what came out of it. And that's why dialogue is so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And encourage people to read. You know, this a book keeps on giving. Right? You can read it once, pick it up, read it again, and something else will happen. And, I'm all for book clubs where everybody reads and then shares their perspectives again, as I am with podcast clubs. Listen to a podcast, come together and discuss what you learned from it, because that's, I think, how we broaden our minds. And it's not just about reading a book, putting it down, and then forgetting about it. It's have the conversation. Whether it's just a novel, whether it's something in particular that has been addressed, have a conversation about it. Let
Yeah.
it stay with you, bring it up. I read this book and this and this and that about it, but I
Well,
don't
and
know where the conversation has gone.
that was one of the great things about teaching literature is, so often I had the experience of teaching something to students who initially thought, oh, I'm not going to like this, or this doesn't sound interesting to me. And then to their surprise and their delight, they discover that they really like something. And, you know, that's like the best reward you can
Yes,
get as a teacher.
that is the point, isn't it? It's you sharing something and then from them making a discovery about not only, what you've shared, but how it reflects on them, or
Yeah.
maybe a reveal of something that's inside of them that they didn't know was there or they didn't understand.
Hmm.
But that's how we grow, isn't it?
Yeah.
As a human race, it's how we grow. And I feel that so much nowadays, people have become headliners, all right? Read the headline, make a judgment call on it, persecute, or it all just from the headline, and nobody's reading content or in the
Well,
right
and
context.
And that's what's so shocking to me about the book bans now.
Yeah,
I can't believe that we're talking about book bans.
I know.
But for someone who's been in education, for most of my
Mm,
adult life, it just blows my mind that people don't understand how powerful education can be. And
hmm
as you said, like, w when you learn, you're expanding yourself, you're transforming yourself,
Yeah.
and you're discovering things about yourself that you didn't know, and hopefully that will continue for the rest of your life.
If we don't stay inquisitive, if
Yeah.
we don't stay wondrous, if we're not always exploring, we're not growing. If we become complacent, that's where complacency can lead to bitterness. It can lead to confusion. It can shut you off. And that's where it goes in and festers inside. We are meant to be curious. The station is called self-discovery of our
Hmm.
wisdom, self-discovery wisdom. The
Hmm.
wisdom is all around us, and we can
Hmm.
channel it down, we can read it, we can converse it, we can observe it. But how do we use that wisdom? That wisdom is to help us actually understand the knowledge that's in our head and how to use it wisely.
Hmm.
But we've got to be engaged.
Hmm.
That's the big one. How do we get people be engaged? And it's their journey, each one of them. But it's how do we get them to actually understand how powerful it is to read a book, how powerful it is to have a conversation, how powerful it is to stand up when you see something wrong and say, no, I'm not on board with that.
Hmm.
All right. It doesn't matter what your friends and things think about it. If you don't like something, speak out.
Yeah. So this is making me think about a reading that I'm going to be doing in a couple of weeks in my hometown. I'm going to be doing a book event
Mm-hmm.
in my hometown, and uh, Pennsylvania is a conservative state.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people in the community I grew up in are rather conservative, and I've been thinking, I've been surprised at how anxious I am about this event.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking about which passages from the book I'm going to read, and I go through this debate with myself where I think, well, I don't want to read that passage because that's likely to offend, these people. But then I say to myself, wait a minute, you wrote this book for a reason. You worked
Yes.
7, 8, 10 years on this book, and this book actually goes back decades in terms of the subject matter, in terms of your life and your experiences and your
Four
memory.
decades. Yeah.
Yeah. So, why are you now,
Mm-hmm.
sort of backtracking and trying to pull your punch?
Mm.
So I think it may be partly the age we live in. I something going back to your earlier question about students, one one other thing that's different about young people today, I think, is that a lot of them are afraid to get involved in a disagreement or a debate because they could be attacked so
Yeah.
quickly and so
There's a,
effectively.
yeah.
So I think something about the courage it takes to speak out nowadays and to
Mm.
speak up for oneself, that may be something that's unique to our era, and all of us, middle-aged people, young people, have to somehow find the wherewithal to do this.
I think, I have three millennials, ranging from 34 to
Mm,
40,
mm,
and each one of them will speak about something they don't like about society and that they will stand up for. But at the same time, the way they choose to stand up for it isn't the same activism that we would have done back in our day. And
mhm.
in a lot of ways, it's like, well, I'm just not going to feed it, so therefore I'm not going to acknowledge it. And it's like, but is that resolving it?
Yeah,
Right? I know you just don't want to. I don't want the negativity, so therefore I'm just not going to let it into my life. Don't let it
yeah,
into your personal life. But if we see something negative and that's wrong out there, if we don't collectively speak out, we're empowering the people to keep doing wrong.
yeah, yeah.
I think our very young generation, like our teens, if they're not glued to their damn phone and TikTok and everything else, I think that many of them are kind of the indigo children, so much more tuned in.
Mm.
And and perhaps will be the people that will speak out the most, because there has been that lapse of speaking out in that millennialism.
Mm-hmm.
They'll go into action more if they believe in veganism. That's what they'll be in. Um, Different type of housing, different this, different that. They'll do it through action,
Mm-hmm.
but not necessarily come together as a chorus and
Yeah.
verbally stand up against something, which
Yeah.
we also need.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would say I'm 68, so a little older than you. And I was brought up in England and then went to South Africa. And I was in South Africa before the apartheid came down. And I would
Mm-hmm.
get into trouble a lot of times for talking to a black person. Or,
Mm.
or why are you having that conversation? And I would have to kind of maybe lie. I'm just giving them instructions. As long as I was bossing them, it was okay. But I couldn't
Mm-hmm.
actually have a conversation. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the amount of trouble I got into it on a numerous occasions on a number of things over there.
Can imagine.
But it just didn't make sense to me, right? That this division eventually left because of misogyny and the apartheid. I couldn't live in there. I couldn't live there anymore. And went to New York actually to see my brother, and then came here to Canada 43 years ago, where we have the indigenous people that are
Mm-hmm.
treated that way. So
Mm.
it's wherever we go, there is an issue.
Yeah.
But until, the whole thing with the indigenous reservation schools and all the deaths and all the things like this wasn't because people were silent that we found out about it. This is because people came together and spoke up and brought the attention to it. And I think
Mm-hmm.
we've got to stop being afraid of bringing attention to something wrong, because if we don't stand up against those negative powers, they win.
Mm-hmm.
And then you wonder, I swear DeSantis has watched Handmaid's Tale and liked it,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because you could see
Yeah.
so many similarities there. And
Yeah.
that's where he wants to turn us back to. And unless you actually come out with the military and start shooting, killing, and everything else, people, you're
Mm-hmm.
not going to change that tide. But if we don't, on the other side of things, speak out and
Mm-hmm.
protest, then they're going to win.
Mm-hmm. What you were saying about growing up in South Africa, it made me think about the life experiences that awaken people and
Mm.
that give people a kind of critical
Yes.
outlook on life. And um, you're fortunate to have come out on the other side of that the way you have.
I was a very naive and very protected girl growing up in England because I was very sickly. So a lot of time in bed, and I didn't really socialize with people. Maybe a girlfriend here and there, but I wasn't a group person. I was so shy and so
Mm.
intimidated amongst group. And then going to South Africa and being thrown into that lifestyle where it was all about, you know, eh, coming together with a barbecue in the backyard and all of that, and thrown into that world. And I
Mm-hmm.
had to kind of invent myself. And so
Mm.
inventing myself as what I wanted to be. But there was the discovery of myself on a different level. But at the same time, it was also the era, the 70s. I went there at
Yeah.
69, the 70s, where, yeah, hippie love and open sexuality. And, I was South Africa's first go-go dancer with a mobile discotheque, and I was a DJ. And I introduced go-go dancing to it. Used to do go-go lessons for people
Wow.
before it became sleazy, and then doing mobile discotheques, going from Malaysian weddings where we were treated like celebrities and into other people's parties, going into people's homes and environments to do this, mobile discotheque parties was an enormous eye opener for a 16-year-old,
Yeah.
and just helped me find myself along the way as well.
Well, and that makes me think about some aspects of my own development. Growing up gay in the 60s and 70s, on the one hand, was a pretty lousy time to
Mm,
grow up gay. On the other hand, that was a gift
yes.
because it made me who I am, and it opened my eyes to the world in a way that I feel I can function in the world,
Yeah.
having lived through those experiences.
How was it coming out to your parents, and what age were you?
I was 20. 22. I grew up in a very Catholic family,
Mm-hmm.
very, very, very Catholic. I had 16 years of Catholic schooling. I went to a Catholic college.
I'm sorry.
Well, there's a lot that was a lot that was great about it, but that was a big obstacle for my parents to overcome when I
Hmm.
came out to them. But I will say to their credit that their love for me overcame
Mm,
whatever blinders their religious upbringing may have put on them.
right.
And
But what
uh,
age were you when you knew you were gay?
I started to suspect that I might be gay when I was in my early teens.
So you
I
had
think
to keep that quiet for so long.
yeah,
So while
yeah,
you're navigating through this, which is a whole different agenda, there's no books on it, there's no manual on it, you're
yeah,
having to keep it quiet at the same time.
yeah. That's right. That's right. And I was bullied as a child and all through my
Mm,
teens, and I was also having to keep that kind of quiet
yes,
because for that to be discussed would mean necessarily to discuss my sexuality, and
right.
my family wasn't ready for that.
Yeah.
So
And of
yeah,
course, for you to tell them, and then within a few months, the whole AIDS thing happening,
exactly.
kind of just throwing them right into the deep end there.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember one of my siblings when I came out to her, her first thought was, "Oh my God, you're going to get AIDS."
Hmm.
Um, so, it was the early 80s when I came out to them. So it's understandable that they would have
Well, especially the way it was being
thought of that.
portrayed.
Exactly.
If you're
Exactly.
gay, you're going to have AIDS. That was it,
That's right.
right? It didn't matter if were in a monogamous relationship or, you were conscious using condoms or anything like that. If you were gay, you were not only going to get AIDS, but you were the AIDS carrier and everybody else would get it from you. And that was what was pitched out there all the time.
My parents, I think my coming out to my parents, it transformed them in some ways because
Hmm.
they would tell me stories about being out with friends and someone would make a homophobic remark,
Mm,
and they would stand up to them and
mm,
say something. And you often hear people talk about um, how powerful it is if you know someone,
yes,
and how that personal connection with someone can change the way you see the world.
right.
It's not just an abstract, it's like knowing someone who's transgender versus just hearing about it, reading
Yeah,
about it, or knowing someone who's, you know, a person of color rather than just seeing them on TV or reading
exactly.
about.
Yes,
Um,
I mean, I kind of, I suppose, I'm more childlike. I see your color as far as your culture is concerned. I see the gayness as far as that is the identity of your sexuality. But for me, it's always been if I don't see your heart and soul, I don't see you.
yeah.
So, I don't care what package you come in. You know, I went through a different persecution of being a spiritual person.
Mm,
So, because I was a reader, as a psychic, and I saw things in different ways. So I went through different forms of persecution of that.
mm,
And also having to hold myself back on what I saw or what I felt because people, would either be weary of me or ridicule or whatever. So, we've all carry something, but that's
yeah.
part of the package of in our discovery of who we are and what makes us stronger. And is it, I think it was Trevor Noah was saying we don't have to enjoy the experience, but who we become because of the experience we can enjoy.
Yeah.
So it's all a question of don't we, I'm telling people all the time, please be present with self in your own essence,
Mm,
because that's where your clarity is. But
hmm.
again, when you're having an emotion of fear or disconnect or whatever, don't feed that emotion. Go through the emotion.
Hmm.
Ask why that emotion is there. Is it justified? Is it valid? What are you going to do about it? Empower the solution, but don't get stuck in the emotion because then it becomes unreasonable and consuming, and you've forgotten what it was all about in the first place.
Yeah. And I think for me, being present, a lot of that happens for me through writing and
Yeah,
creativity. If
yeah,
I explore something in writing, that's a way to inhabit the experience, to try to understand it on a deeper level.
Do you find with your writing that you may have an outline of what you want to do, but when the fingers get typing or get writing, you know what, how it comes together, the characters, the people, and the story then kind of becomes a life of its own?
I do experience that, and
Mm.
I like outlines very much. I
Hmm.
work with outlines. I rely on them, um, but
That's the
it's
framework for the
the blueprint,
content.
it's the
Yeah,
framework
yeah,
exactly. And then and that's one of the great pleasures of writing is when the writing takes over,
yes,
and I can feel, like I'm following some kind of ascent,
yeah.
that I wasn't quite aware of at first.
Mm.
Um, so it's, for me, there's a productive tension between having a plan,
Hmm.
having an idea of a beginning, a middle, and an end, knowing where I want to get to. But then when I start to compose, really trying to ride some sort of creative wave that may take me places I don't expect. I always feel like if I don't surprise myself when
Yeah.
I write, then I'm not quite in the zone.
My brother is a professional writer and he taught, script and writing, the
Huh.
professional level. And he is the professional writer. So, and he has a whole format of what he does. And I've just written my so-called memoir. It's just my voyage of my journey of life.
Mm-hmm.
From my perspectives, but I've written very much about like almost each one of them can stand alone. It's not I was born, although some things have been rearranged into early days and later days, but it's always about kind of the statement of where I was, but where I am now. Um, so
Mm-hmm.
my brother is reading it, and
Mm.
but it's a totally different type of writing to what he would write. But
Yeah.
people have asked me for my story for my book, and I can't give them anything other than Sarah. Now, Sarah has dyslexia. I can't spell, and my grammar is terrible when it comes to writing. So I've actually, against, what some people's horrors, have actually used the chat AI to edit my book.
Uh-huh.
And
Yes.
if you phrase it properly, which my dear son-in-law did, as to edit it in my voice and in my flow, it
Yeah.
actually is edited very much like that, but just made it more cohesive and tighter. But it's still going to be in that format of, each story can stand on its own. Because one thing I've done with interviewing authors through the years is that there's really no wrong or right way in the way you want to present it. It's
Mm-hmm.
just to make sure that the flow is there, that people can ride it and
Mm.
go from page to page with it,
Mm-hmm.
because they can feel it. And I think the best form of writing when I talk to authors is when, yes, you have the framework, you know what you want to discuss, but you
Mm-hmm.
allow it to come through you and come out. In other words, you get out of your head
Yeah.
and you allow the essence of you to go and write, because then what it reveals back to you is very much the truth of what it is and who you are.
There's an interesting way in which the unconscious
Mm,
functions when we write.
yes,
Uh, it's fascinating.
it is.
In your memoir, did you find yourself altering things in any way for any reason?
I've redefined, but no, it is. Somebody was saying, "Oh, I can't reiterate your memoir and all the juicy pain things you went through," and I don't. I address them. This
Yeah.
happened to me, that happened to me. It wasn't pleasant. This, that. But it is how I've moved on. For me, it's always forward thinking, forward living.
Yes.
And
Yes.
but what has happened to me has been very much part of the building blocks of who I am today. And yes, there are some sore spots there. There are some scars, but there's also been some revelations of revealing of who I am that I never saw in myself before. So in reading it back, I found there was a continuity of certain sadness and disconnect from humanity, which is
Mm-hmm.
still very much there because I just do not understand how humans can be so cruel to each other. And I never
Mm-hmm.
will. And I don't want to understand why you're so cruel to each other. I just want you to get your act together. Right. But it's always driven from the consciousness of what I call the knowingness, which is channeling the wisdom, letting it sit with your heart and truth, going into your spirit into action for your mind to know what your mind needs to know when you need to know it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's from where I live. I don't think, I feel my thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
If I think my thoughts before feeling them, I'm in confusion. If I allow it to go through all the intellect of the soul, heart, and spirit, I actually then understand what thoughts are necessary.
Yeah,
So
I
that's
like
how my book is written.
I love it. So this novel that I recently published was originally a memoir.
Mm-hmm.
I started it as a memoir about 25 years ago, and when I wrote it as a memoir, I was writing 5 to 10 years after the events that I was referring to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the problems with the book when it was a memoir, I liked it, but I wasn't completely satisfied with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason was there were a couple of reasons. One was I hadn't lived long enough to have the necessary perspective
Yeah.
on the experiences that I was trying to write
Mm-hmm.
about.
Yeah.
The other thing is I just don't think I knew what I was trying to say about myself,
Mm-hmm.
which is a challenge for memoirists to
Yes.
know what are you trying to say about yourself. I mean, it's we can recall all kinds of
Mm.
things that we did and thought and felt and said, but when you write about it, you're putting it together in such a way to make a statement about yourself, and I
Yeah.
think I hadn't done that.
Mm.
And one of the things that I've been so happy about is realizing that for me, fiction frees me from some of what I felt were the limitations of memoir.
So you did
And
faction.
I did faction, yes.
Mm. I love it.
Yeah.
Because
And
there's the truth and the underlying roots of everything there, but the fiction just kind of allows it to go somewhere where the fact can't.
exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. And I remember when I realized I can change certain facts because
Mm.
they're actually standing in the way of the story that I'm trying to tell.
Right.
It took me decades to discover what that story was, but I feel like I finally did it.
But it's like me and my brother as a writer, but I always know him in the book. Whatever
Yeah.
he's writing about, whether it's a kid, whether it's this or that, there's always the identity of my brother there, right?
Yes.
Whatever format it's in. And I think that is, when people read that book, they're going to recognize you in it. They're going to
Yeah.
recognize the essence of who you are, but all you've done is taken that liberty to storytell it rather than just to factualize it.
Yeah. And all writing is personal in some
Yes.
memoir is overtly so.
Hmm.
Um, do you
Yeah,
have a title,
it's
do you have a title for your book?
yeah, a voice to
You don't
self.
have to tell us.
No, no, it's a voyage to self-discovery. I'm on the last edit. As I said, I had AI edit. Now it's the formation of where the chapters go, and I don't call them chapters. It's just 1, 2, 3, and 4 with the titles,
Uh-huh.
and it's just going through that and then designing the book cover because obviously going to be self-publication. I do enough promotion of other people's work so I can promote myself. But actually, it's the what I am going into is what I call pod books, podcast books, where we're actually the next series is going to be the Forgotten Children series. And it's a collaboration of people on children and how we really need to reinvest in our children so we don't have dysfunctional adult society later. And it becomes a fundraiser supporting their organizations or what they're doing. And then the next book will be a business one, and the book after that will be the Forgotten Seniors. So we're going into that as well.
I love all these mountain peaks on
Yeah.
the horizon.
Yes, well, that was something that was given to me. This is my 10th year of my network, and I've been podcasting for 11 years. And it's like I knew that I wanted to do more than just do the shows, and then I wanted to expand out. So I have mentors and practitioners as well that profile their thing. And I wanted the books to be something where their voice was extended and not
Mm,
just podcasts, a huge library here, over 3,000 shows, but it's the with such wonderful wisdom, it needs to have other platforms in order to expand out.
mhm.
So yeah. But again, it was when I first started this, when somebody asked me to be join her podcast network and go, what's a podcast? This was back in 2012. I didn't know. I did it live for 13 months, pressed all the wrong buttons on the first show. And then
Mm,
even when I started my own network, I didn't know what I was doing. I had to learn as I went.
Hmm.
and just, allowed myself to evolve and then get to a rhythm where I feel, yes, I wear all the hats. I can handle all of these. Can I do this? Can I do that? Yes, but I'm going to stick within my rhythmal vibration of what I can do and and people I want to collaborate with. I'm not going to go off frequency. Right? Stay into your parameters, but we can expand and be creative within those, right?
Yes, yes.
So this book is already out?
The book is out. It came out in March, and it's called American Scholar, and I'm very excited about it.
Why did you call it The American Scholar?
Uh, because it's about a professor of American literature.
Hmm.
Because one of the things that he writes about and does research on is another professor of American literature who's an actual historical figure. Um, and then there's a famous essay by the American writer Ralph Waldo Emerson called The American Scholar.
Hmm.
He wrote it in 1837. And it's a wonderful essay. I recommend it to anybody um, who likes literature. Um, but in this essay, Emerson is talking to a very young nation. It's 1837.
Hmm.
And the nation has political independence, but it doesn't yet have cultural independence
Mm,
from Europe and Great Britain. And Emerson is on the lookout for the next great American artist.
mm,
And, and the word scholar in his title really refers to any sort of artist or intellectual. It's not
hmm.
just student or professor.
Student
Uh,
of life.
a student of life,
Mm,
exactly. And his argument is really, and it's related to what we've been talking about. His argument is that you need to start by looking within and and focus on who you are. And if you do that to the fullest extent, you will find
hmm.
that other people can relate to it.
100%. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
There's great wisdom in that essay, The American Scholar.
I'm going to be looking it up for sure
Yeah,
because
yeah.
that is what I preach all the time.
A classic.
Yeah, it's so many people are chasing the facade of the outside, and that
Yeah,
really life is an inside out job. And when you actually
yeah,
embrace the gift of who you are and what you're here to do, the essence of you will, and frequency of you will resonate out so more exponentially than it
yeah,
would have this constant chasing the expectation of societal dictation, which is screwing us up left, right, and center. So
yeah,
yeah, I'm definitely going to read that. That's where the wisdom is, right? The wisdom is throughout history. There's a great deal of wisdom to find in the negative history as well as the positive history. And it's
yeah.
if we're not willing to read, if we're not willing to learn, if we're not willing to explore, if we're not willing to participate in our own lives, then we're going to get what we get and we can't groan and mumble about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let's educate ourselves on it. This isn't your only book, is it?
No,
Yeah.
it's my fourth book.
And the
I've
other books cover?
So my first book was a memoir,
Mm.
actually. It was about movies that I loved as a child, and I try to look at them from an adult perspective and understand what was it about those movies that mattered to me when I was a child.
Name a
And then
couple of them. I'm intrigued.
um, The Sound of Music.
Yes, yes, definitely. Great, sort of one of my favorites. Yes, what else?
Yes. The movie Dog Day Afternoon,
Yes, I do know I'd remember seeing it, but I don't
75.
remember. Yeah, yeah, no, it was a long time ago. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Al Pacino plays a bisexual bank robber,
Hmm.
and it was one of the first what I would call positive portrayals of a of an LGBT person that I'd ever seen. I was a teenager when I
You're
saw
right,
it,
right.
and it came just at the right time. I
Yeah.
was 16 years old, and um, yeah, and a bunch of others.
Intrigued to know what else. Okay, what other books have you written?
Then I published two novels, one called Portraits at an Exhibition, which is about a young man. It takes place during 1 hour in this young man's life. He's in an art museum looking at paintings, and the novel is about what's going on with him during that hour,
Mm,
as well as the paintings that he's looking at.
mm.
Um, and then the next novel I published is called Pennsylvania Station, and it's about an architect who's trying to save New York's old Penn Station from being demolished.
Mm-hmm.
And it was demolished in 1963. So
Racing of history again, right?
yes, so
Yeah.
those are the books that I've written, and now this new one, American Scholar.
So for you, it's always important to have in the foundation of your story is the element of truth or what, what has been historical, and
Yes,
then
there's
build from
there's
there what the historical has the impact on today.
absolutely, absolutely, and also some form of art. Every book that I've written revolves around an art form,
Hmm.
and how people interact with that art form, whether it's film or painting or architecture or
Mm.
literature.
Yes,
Uh, I find, for me, stories emerge from those encounters with works of art.
yes. And that's the thing, that's again, people can look at different works of art and they're going to get something totally different from the next person. What
Mhm.
does it mean to you in the moment? And what it means to you in the moment is where you are in the moment. And that's what's so fascinating because you could look at that painting or that art down the road and have a total different discovery about yourself. And that's what's exciting and intriguing.
Right. And actually, the my novel Portraits at an Exhibition, it's about very much what you just said. It's about a young man who has just had a risky sexual encounter, and he thinks that he might have contracted HIV.
Mm,
So the next morning, he calls in sick to work, and he takes himself to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to take his mind off of his fears and to look at some paintings. So the paintings that he's looking at are very much filtered through what's going on in his
right.
life at that moment. And that has
Mm,
that has always interested me. It interested me when I was in graduate school, when I was teaching literature. I'm always interested in how people interpret something based partly on who they are and where and when they are.
right.
That
The
rather
spark.
than
Mm,
yeah, rather than trying to think of some, you know, true interpretation for all time and all
yes.
people. I'm
Not
interested in
generalizing, focusing in
exactly,
on, yeah. And
exactly.
again, that is kind of again the uh, relatability when we read something where we can feel a little of ourselves in there,
Yes, yes,
a reflection. It doesn't matter if it's somebody who thinks they have AIDS or is gay or is not, whatever. You see something of yourself in there. I have that feeling when I see this, or that triggers that, and that's the inspiration begets invitation, and the inspiration of the story invites you to look at yourself in a different way. And then what you do about it is up to you, but I love those reveals, and if we allow ourselves to immerse ourselves into the different cultures of wonderment and exploration, the reveals of who we are and what we stand for, or where we are right now, are things that propel us forward in life.
yeah.
So read, folks.
That's a good punctuation mark for this conversation.
So all of your books can be found on Amazon.
Yes, they're all on Amazon. You can also get them through my website, which is patrickehorrigan.com.
Would you spell that out for the people who are just listening, please?
Absolutely. PatrickEhorrigan.com. PatrickEhorrigan.com. That's my website. Um,
Excellent. Wonderful. And I've really enjoyed this conversation tremendously. We've
thank you,
really
Sarah.
covered a great deal, which is what I love. The box of
Yeah,
chocolates, we went and tasted every one of them. I love it. But that invitation of why you write, what the basis of what you were writing, always a little of yourself in there, because that's
yeah,
where your truth lies. But you've been willing to look at yourself through different perspectives or different eyes that
yeah,
has allowed you to express in different ways. And anybody, I would love people who read your books to please comment back on this and let us know from listening to the show what it relates to you. And when you read his books, what it's meant to you, because that feedback isn't just a pat on the back. It's showing us that we are actually reaching the people we want to reach,
So
right?
true.
That you are
So
being
true.
affected by it, because that's why we do what we do. We want to help people on their own reveal, on their
Yeah.
own self-discovery, on their own self-empowerment. And you do it for the art of books. I do it here through podcasting, interviewing excellent authors like yourself. And the reason we do it is because we all can get lost, we can all can get confused. But if we're willing to listen, to learn, and then apply, we can
Yeah.
get ourselves back on track on the right road.
Mm. Sounds wonderful.
Thank you so much. Next book, please come back. Definitely. I'd love to have you on here again. It's been a delightful conversation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for everything.
My pleasure. And to everyone else out there, read, read. Curl up in a nice comfy chair, glass of wine by your side, read a good book. I love reading outside in the sunlight or on the patio there with the wind blowing and really getting into a book. Whatever way you read, read. I promise you who you are when you finish that book is a nice reveal. I promise you. Until next time, bye for now. We hope that you enjoyed the show. There are so many more for you here on selfdiscoverywisdom.com. Just go to the podcast tab at the top there and you will see all the many genres and all 3,000 shows ready for your listening. We are here to serve you, to help you on your journey of life, and we know that through inspiration it begets invitation. We are supported by you, the listeners, and those that we interview. Anything that you can spare us in donation would be greatly accepted, and we do hope that you enjoy the next show.